It's common practice for the British to boast about their victories over native indigenous people around the globe. However, what you often don't hear is when the British were absolutely destroyed by the same group of people they often viewed as inferior, primitive, and savage. The Māori were often depicted as cannibals and mass murderers, making them the bad people. If the native tribes in America, Australia, or New Zealand also killed each other, then what makes the British killing natives any different? Well, the answer lies in the brainwashing of Western media. The British were gentlemen, civilized, and well-cultured, whilst on the other hand, the Māori were depicted as uncivilized, cunning, deceitful savages, making it okay for the British to kill native populations, but bad for anyone else to do so. Now, the Māori people weren't uncivilized. They had their own way of socializing between other tribes and nations. They had their own culture, and in some instances had a better moral compass than the British. By the conclusion of this video, I hope that you will see that not only did the Māori have some of the most honorable warriors in all history, but they were able to beat the British physically, mentally, and even ethically at the Battle of Gate Pa. In the winter of 1863, the British troops invaded the Waikato region. The British attempted to crush the Māori King or Kingitanga movement that was viewed by the colonial government as a challenge to the supremacy of the British monarchy. The following year, the fight came to Tauranga because it supplied both food and warriors. But they were met with resistance from Tauranga Māori, who built several pa, which are Māori fortifications, which were to draw the British out from their base, kind of like a taunt, baiting them to attack and leave their defensive positions at the Strand and Elms area. So this led to the Battle of Pukehinahina, or Gate Pa. Here, the British forces suffered a humiliating defeat on April the 29th, 1864, with 31 killed and 80 wounded, including many senior officers, despite outnumbering their Māori foe 4-1. In total, numbering around 2,000 British against roughly 500 Māori warriors. The Māori forces were victorious due to their ingenious constructions of fighting trenches. The British could not breach these fortifications and were driven out of the Māori pa. The Māori involved in the battle were mainly from Tauranga Moana iwi, so this is Nai Te Rangi, Ngāti Rangi Nui, and Ngāti Pukenga. I attempted my best, to say these. So the Māori casualties are estimated to be between 19 to 32 killed and 25 wounded. So even if they lost the same amount of troops, this meant that one Māori took out 4 British soldiers each. So in this humiliating defeat, it had people wondering, how do professional sailors and soldiers lose to half-armed, half-naked savages? Well, let me explain. The Māori with prep time are the equivalent to Batman with prep time. Give them a shovel and they'll make fortifications that will withstand 8 hours of straight bombardment with minimal casualties. This is all because the defenses of Pukehinahina, Gate Pa, were designed by Pene Takatuya, who is said to have learned his military engineering during the Northern War of 1845-46. This new pa made extensive use of rua, or anti-artillery bunkers, and its concealed trenches, meaning the British had a false sense of security when they stormed it. Because of these numerous bunkers that were prepared, rather than having several large bunkers, they dispersed their troops in such a wide spread to avoid losing many people at one time, minimizing losses from artillery fire. So when the battle came, at most 15 Māori soldiers were killed by shell fire. The pa's garrison of around 250 was split between 2 defensive positions or redoubts. About 200 held the main redoubt, which was approximately 80 meters long and 18 meters wide. Its triple line of trenches had been timbered over and piled with earth for protection. A ditch and bank led to a smaller redoubt, so smaller fortification consisting of a double line of covered trenches surrounded by a light palisade or wall, which is known as a pekerangi. So now we're coming up to the night of the attack. General Sir Duncan Alexander Cameron arrived in Tauranga with reinforcements on the 21st of April 1864. 7 days later, he led 1,700 men out of camp at Te Papa. Expectations of victory were extremely high because the British played this very, very safe. And they had superior firepower and outnumbered the Māori 4-1. So not only that, to prevent any of the defenders escaping, Cameron ordered the 68th Regiment to take up positions behind the pa to cut off their water supply and their escape route. That evening, the 9 officers whose units were to lead the attack on the pa gathered for dinner at the Elms, the mission home of Archdeacon Alfred Brown and his wife. Only one of these officers made it home and survived. This was Assistant Sergeant William Manley of the Royal Artillery, who survived the following day's assault, awarded the Victoria Cross for his attempts to save the life of Commander George Hay of the HMS Harrier during the battle. Now, many of the accounts like to blame the big defeat, the biggest failure ever, on the fact that the British had a clumsy formation, and also on the fact that the British had a lot of overconfidence. So these were the reasons that were stated or recounted as to why they lost. But in reality, they were just trying to find any excuse as to why they got destroyed. So at daybreak on the 29th of April, the British force was ready for battle. They had the Māori surrounded. Remember, they cut off their water supply and their escape route. Outnumbered. And they were also ready with the biggest artillery cannons they could muster. So they had a skirmishing line facing the Māori position, which would lay down covering fire, while the main assault party of 300 men, made up of the soldiers from the 43rd Regiment, led by Lieutenant Colonel H.G. Booth, and a naval brigade led by Commander Hay. So despite the fact that Cameron's men had experience with anti-artillery pa, in other words, these bunker-like structures, they had confidence that they had the firepower to blow the pa to the devil, as their 110 and 40-pounder Armstrong guns and 24-pounder howitzers went to work. The pa was bombarded for 8 hours straight. 8 hours! That's like sitting through all of One Piece, but whilst your house is getting bombed the entire time. Now back to the Māori victory downplay excuses. Some eyewitnesses claimed that much of the artillery fire was ineffective. Some shots missed the target altogether. And according to one account, the men of the 68th behind the pa were at greater risk of being hit than were the Māori defenders. So the British were apparently hitting their own men. So that's one of the reasons why apparently they lost. Nevertheless, progress was made in breaching one of the corners of the pa. So around lunchtime, a gun was repositioned to fire on the smaller redoubt. So, the one that had the 200 men, right? And at 4 p.m, with no sign of life inside of the pa, Cameron ordered the assault to proceed. So Booth and Hay decided to attack together. The assault party formed up 4 abreast in what the military historian Chris Pugsley has described as a clumsy formation. They would rely on enthusiasm and dash qualities that were not to be enough. With his sword raised, Booth waved the men forward. Almost immediately, the assault party was met by a very sharp fire. The breach in the pa's outer defenses was easily negotiated, but Māori firing from concealed trenches. So they basically had secret tunnels, which soon inflicted heavy casualties.
Secret tunnel through the mountain.
So some British soldiers had the horrific experience of being shot from below. Imagine walking along and getting shotgunned in the PP. That is terrifying. Booth now led many of the 43rd towards the smaller pa. Among its defenders was the only woman still inside Gate Pa, Heni Te Kiri Karamu, who had refused to leave her brother's side when the assault began. Ferocious close quarters fighting inside the smaller pa claimed the lives of Booth and many of his men. So let's talk about the defeat. After the naval brigade entered the main earthworks, some of its defenders apparently fled, but were driven back inside by the men of the 68th station behind it. So a confused battle then took place within the narrow confines of this pa. The British reserved force was sent in forward. So this is rather strange, they sent them in quite early. So you had the British and their main assault party plus the reserves were stuck trying to force their way through a narrow gap into a honeycombed interior of the pa. This is literally 300, but with guns and bunkers, and the Spartans are the Māori, basically. And the Persians are just trying to get through this small choke point. So the Māori weren't just using primitive weapons, by the way. They'd been using guns for almost 100 years by this time, and they were using tupara, or in other words, a double-barrel shotgun. When the Maori were evacuating or trying to escape, but because that party, remember, that had crept around the back and got a surround on them, in the cover of night, they went through the swamps to cut off the water supply and their escape route. So because these Maori had attempted to run away and escape and saw the 68th Regiment, they decided to go back to the Pa. Now, the British interpreted this as reinforcements, so that's why this really confused battle then took place. Not only did they just lose many of their British officers, remember how I said 1 out of 9 survived? They lost all their officers very early on in this battle. With no clear leadership, those storming the Pa from the front fled in panic, believing that the garrison was being reinforced by the Māori re-entering it from the rear. Remember, because they tried to escape and then they saw the 68th and they turned around and they came back, and then now the British are panicking, thinking that they're getting reinforcements. So the British left their dead and their wounded where they fell. And as we mentioned at the beginning of the video, the British lost twice that of the Maori's estimated casualties. So it was now far too late in the day for Cameron to contemplate another assault. During the night, the defenders gathered their wounded and slipped past the men of the 68th, but not before Heni Te Kirikaramu performed an act of mercy. So this was that only woman that was left to defend the Pa. Hearing the cries of the dying Lieutenant Colonel Booth and several other wounded soldiers, she took them water, which she poured into her hands for them to drink. Later, when the fighting in Tauranga had ended, a British officer, Lieutenant Colonel Dominic Gamble, acknowledged Ngaiterangi as an enemy anything but despicable, either in intelligence or courage. So not only did the Māori outclass the British using dirty tactics, cutting off water supplies and cutting off their escape route, and they even resorted to using scorched earth tactics of just bombarding the enemy for 8 hours straight. The Māori even gave water to the British wounded when the British tried to cut off the Māori from the exact thing that they're supplying, water. So even morally speaking, the Māori acted in a far more civilized manner than the British here. They deserved to be respected better than what history has recounted of them, calling them primitive, uncivilized savages. And this is because of the code of conduct that the Māori had written up that they had to abide by, that the wounded should be treated fairly. So Gate Pa was a major disaster for the British military. Some branded the assault party as cowards. The Māori described the British as men who ran away howling. Defeat at the hands of half-naked, half-armed savages was unforgivable, let alone leaving behind the dead and dying. Those present blamed each other for the catastrophe. However, Cameron was chastised for being too rash by some and overly cautious by others. He struggled to explain the reason for his defeat, which significantly dented his reputation. And sending in the reserves too soon created a bottleneck, rather than staggering out the troops. That played into the hands of the Pa's defenders. Think of it like, if you send more people at once, your bullets will hit more targets at the same time. So the Māori's shots were more effective in hitting more people than the opposite. Those that are in the bottleneck can only shoot one at a time, whereas everybody that are on the outside of the bottleneck, or in other words the Māori, are able to shoot all of their bullets in one concentrated spot in a funnel. So they would have much more effect with their weapons and their bullets. So this is apparently why the British were defeated, because they were bottlenecked. In the aftermath of Gate Pa, Governor Grey attempted to cut his losses, and he wrote to a relative that, "We are all here plunged into a sorrow and grief that I cannot describe." He arrived in Tauranga on the 12th of May and spoke of his desire for the two races to be at peace. However, at this point, they made peace only on the condition that they retain their lands and their freedom. So the Māori forced the British into peace. You have to remember the British forces' reasoning for coming to Aotearoa in the first place, or New Zealand, was to expand their empire and make money. If the investment costs more than the reward, that's a terrible business investment. The Māori were killing far too many of the Crown's men and made the British pay dearly to steal from them. The cost was greater than the benefit. So this is why the British often negotiated unfair deals to try make a profit out of greed. I'd argue that the Māori demonstrated better moral values than the British here in the Battle of Gate Pa. They weren't fighting for greed, but in the defense of their homes, their lands, and their freedom. I would like to finish by reading one amazing YouTube comment that kind of sums up my thoughts on the Maori nicely here. Please don't ever think all white people are ignorant to your contributions to both this country and the world, because there's a lot of us who see you for you and never the statistic for which you are continuously judged by. Your contribution to the game of rugby is also over a century old, with an impressive record over Tier 1 teams. Let no one say your people never did anything worthy of praise, because you have shown time and time again that you punch above your weight. I just thought I'd say this looking from the outside in. On that note, thank you for watching. I love you all. Maori ora. Until next time, kia kaha.